Great, wonderful. Thank you. I've see so many friends and also people that I admire in terms of the work they've been doing. So it's really a pleasure to be able to connect with you all and be one of the speakers in this sort of science, neuroscience, and society. That's what we're really interested in is figuring out ways to in my case, study stress and resilience and really study the pathways by which interventions can really help society, broadly speaking. And so, in fact, a lot of the newer work that I've been thinking about is really focusing on implementation science and how do we build, in this case, mindfulness interventions at scale that can really make an impact. So I'll speak to that at the end. I'm kind of going with the provisional title here, How Do Mindfulness Interventions Work? And really want to talk to you all today. I assume folks can hear me okay. Martha, can you hear me okay? Okay. And I assume you guys can see the slides okay. But I really want to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing in my lab. I'm the director of the Health and Human Performance Lab at Carnegie Mellon University. So I'm in psychology and neuroscience here at Carnegie Mellon. And we study stress and resilience, and we're really interested in these biobehavioral pathways by which mindfulness interventions might influence health. So I wanted to kind of unpack that a little bit and sort of talk to you about this program of research we've been doing, which really I think aims to broadly link behavior to brains, to peripheral physiology, to health. So that's kind of the pathway we're gonna explore, and love to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions and conversation. I've kind of geared this around 50 minutes or so, so I'm happy to field questions, although with the way my slides are set up, I don't know if I'll see questions. So Martha, maybe you could help me if someone pops up and you want to interject, feel free. But I'll certainly make time for at the end here for a longer discussion. So let me see if I can get my slides to work. Okay, so really over the last decade and a half, we've just seen this tremendous surge in public interest in mindfulness meditation, mindfulness interventions. And, we see these nationally representative samples here in the US every couple of years where people are reporting on their use of meditation. And every couple of years a new survey comes out and we see increasing numbers. In this case, as of 2012 or so, there were about 10 million people in the US who said that they had practiced meditation in the last 12 months. So there's lots of people doing this stuff. People are signing up for the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program. Increasingly, people are seeking out intensive mindfulness meditation retreats, or they're plugging into now hundreds of different mindfulness training smartphone apps. So there's just been a lot of interest in this space here in the US and abroad. And I think paralleling that has been a real dramatic increase in scientific interest. So in a review paper on this topic now a couple of years ago, I sort of counted up the number of randomized control trials of mindfulness training interventions. So randomized control trials are sort of, our gold standard for evaluating mindfulness intervention effects. And what you can see here is like over the last 15 years, this exponential increase in the number of trials coming out in this area. And I think if we look at this sort of first wave of randomized control trials, we're starting to see some initial evidence that mindfulness interventions can be an evidence-based treatment for a broad range of mental and physical health outcomes. We've seen in some initial trials that it can help reduce depression relapse in at-risk individuals. It can help treat addictive disorders and people suffering from addiction. We're seeing some initial indication that mindfulness interventions may impact the immune system and protect people against HIV/AIDS, and even some initial data to suggest that it might help treat people with chronic pain, particularly low back pain. So I think some promising initial indications that there may be, broad-ranging health benefits. I think we're still early, but there's some suggestion here that we've got a something we want to invest more time and research in. And since we're seeing these promising health benefits across a wide spectrum of health and disease outcomes, my lab has really asked, well, like, how is it that mindfulness interventions, how do they impact such a broad range of health outcomes, and how do these interventions work? And so that's really where we've been spending a lot of time, and what I wanted to talk to you all about today. And so, in the first part of this talk, what I want to do is really start on the biological side and really talk about, well, how do mindfulness interventions become biologically embedded for health? What are the sort of brain and physiology pathways that might be driving such a broad range of health outcomes? And I'm really going to frame it with our theoretical account that we published on the mindfulness stress buffering account. And so I'll unpack that and talk about some illustrative studies in this space. Really to kind of speak to this biological embedding question, which is something we've been working on for a long time. And then the second half of the talk, what I want to do is actually say, well, and this is something we've been working on the last 6 or so years in my lab, what are the key behavioral skills that people are learning in mindfulness interventions that really might kick off this biological embedding? So really, what are these sort of behavioral pathways? And I'm going to frame this conversation on behavioral skills with a theory we've put out called monitor and acceptance theory, and then talk about some research we've done in this space that really kind of speaks to this question of like, what's the secret sauce? Like, what are people learning that might really drive this kind of biological stress resilience over time? And then I'll just sort of wrap up with some next steps. So that's what we're going to do. Let's start with this biological embedding side of the story. And over the last 15 years, we've really been working on kind of looking at biological mechanisms, namely, how do these mindfulness interventions sort of change the brain, change our peripheral physiology, and change our stress-related health risks over time. And one of the first insights we had in developing this model was that when you look at all of these health outcomes that we're seeing with mindfulness interventions, everything from depression relapse to addictive disorders to the immune system to HIV/AIDS to chronic pain, for example. These are all stress-sensitive disorders and conditions. In fact, stress plays a prominent role in triggering the onset or exacerbation of disease pathogenesis in each of these cases. And that maybe mindfulness interventions are really changing stress resilience pathways in ways that might be mitigating or impacting these broad-ranging stress-related health outcomes over time. And so we then really moved to thinking about a biological embedding account, like what are the pathways that may be critically important here? And we put out this current directions paper now a number of years ago that really lays out this account, and I wanted to unpack some pieces of it today. But our argument goes is that mindfulness training interventions really seem to target two stress resilience pathways in the brain, increasing the activity and connectivity of regulatory regions of prefrontal cortex up here in blue, and in turn sort of cooling off the brain's stress alarm system. So that's kind of our second resilience pathway by which mindfulness interventions might be important. Namely, we've got now a number of studies really showing that mindfulness interventions change activity, connectivity, and even the size or morphology of the amygdala, and particularly the right amygdala. So I'll show you one snapshot there on the sort of the red side of this figure. In this case, it's really turning down, mindfulness interventions really turning down the sort of stress alarm system that the brain puts out when it's exposed to stressors. And our argument goes that if we can sort of modulate these two stress resilience pathways, that in turn should be changing how our bodies are responding to stress. And so in the sort of middle part of this figure now, our argument is that mindfulness interventions presumably should be turning down HPA axis and sympathetic nervous system responsivity when people are exposed to stressful or challenging events. And so I'll tell you a little bit about work that we've done there. And then the argument then is that, well, we know that HPA axis activity, sympathetic nervous system activity, When these become really recurrent, excessive responses over time, that can really exert wear and tear and sort of increase a broad range of health risks. And it can, trigger addiction relapse or depression relapse. It can impact the immune system and so on. And so our argument is that mindfulness interventions may be modulating these sort of peripheral physiological stress response systems in ways that might confer some health protection. So that's kind of the model in broad strokes. But let me tell you about some pieces of evidence that we've sort of collected over the years that sort of scaffold some of these ideas. And so let's start with the brain. And, we've done a series of neuroimaging studies of mindfulness interventions. And my slides are moving around here. I can move that back. No, I don't need to. So we've done a series of neuroimaging studies where we look at using functional brain imaging before and after mindfulness or control interventions. And is it not going to hold on one second, folks? There it goes. The Zoom window keeps moving. There you go. And one question that I think that we were faced with early on. One of the questions we were faced with early on. Let's see if that works. My slides have frozen. There it goes. Okay. How do we study, brains before and after mindfulness interventions? And one approach that we've taken was to really look at resting state functional connectivity. So we asked participants to rest quietly in the scanner and passively stare at a fixation cross. And I know many folks here have sort of done resting state functional connectivity, but when we ask people to stare at this fixation cross, so really looking at the brain at rest, we know that this approach reliably activates the brain's so-called default mode network, shown here in blue in this brain. It's a really reliable distributed network that activates and functionally couples when the brain is at rest. Includes the posterior cingulate cortex here, medial prefrontal cortex, and other regions. It's a very reliable signal. When we have people do this task, we can get this resting state map in everybody. And we got really interested in this resting brain network because there was some early cross-sectional work. This is a study that came out in PNAS in 2011 by Judd Brewer's group. And they recruited a sample of advanced mindfulness meditation practitioners. These were folks that had practiced for the last couple of years every day, and they compared them to age and sex match controls. And what they found in this initial PNAS paper was that these advanced meditators had a really different sort of resting state functional connectivity map. They did these posterior cingulate seeds, and they found that these advanced meditators had connectivity between the posterior cingulate and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a sort of regulatory region that we know is important in attention and emotion regulation, and it's not really seen in the default mode network resting state connectivity maps. It's sort of this, frontoparietal control network region that does not couple with the default mode network. And this really suggested to us that, well, maybe mindfulness meditation is really coupling the resting brain with these regulatory areas of prefrontal cortex, and maybe this sort of coupling with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex may be sort of like a brain-based biomarker for stress resilience. And we wanted to test this initial study that came out in 2011. It was with advanced meditators. It was a cross-sectional study. it was only 11 subjects in that initial trial. And, we were like, well, maybe it was meditation training, but it could be a whole host of other things. In fact, people who have a regular meditation practice may, have healthier lifestyles and better sleep patterns. And so we wanted to do more of a prospective study to look at this. And so we recruited a stressed, unemployed, job-seeking adult sample here in Pittsburgh. This unemployment is this really great chronic stress model. Unemployed folks are a really great group to study. As it turns out, they're easy to find in that we went to employment agencies here in Pittsburgh, and we put ads in the job classified section of the newspapers, and they turned up in droves. And I think unemployment, it's a situation where you've got lots of stressors that are hitting. And many of those stressors have to do with financial insecurity. So they really were responsive to knowing that they could get paid to participate in a trial. And they don't really have a lot of places to turn for their stress management support needs. And so we had a real success in terms of recruiting this population. One of the other cool things about this particular trial is they were really engaged. And in fact, we only had one person drop out by 4-month follow-up. So we have these amazing retention numbers and engagement numbers. So they really, I think, responded to this type of program. But what did we do? We took the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program and we condensed it down into a 3-day residential retreat. So this was Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Folks came into our retreat center here in North Pittsburgh. We took a blood sample and then they were randomized to one or the other wing of the retreat center. So everyone was getting a nice 3-day retreat. The retreats we called him and her, health enhancement through mindfulness or health enhancement through relaxation. It was a fairly intensive dose. In fact, I wrote an initial grant to do this work, and it was promptly rejected because everyone said, no way people are going to come in and want to do residential retreats in more of an intensive format. And that's actually not what we found. People really loved this retreat experience. People who are financially insecure and coming in, we offered dormitory style housing, and we had 3 hot meals a day and an opportunity really to connect with others who were in similar life circumstances. So folks really liked this format. And it was actually fairly inexpensive. But for us and the science that we were doing with these kind of multimodal mindfulness interventions, one of the key things that we could do with this retreat format was really structurally match the programs. And so we were pretty obsessive about this, in that both groups got the same positive retreat experience with engaged instructors and other people who are sort of, providing that social support. So, one of the questions we had was, does mindfulness training, above and beyond all of these nice features you might get in a 3-day relaxation program, have these benefits? Does it actually foster, changes in the brain and changes in stress resilience over time? So when I say structurally matched, like we were pretty obsessive about this. So folks in the mindfulness group, they did a stretching activity for an hour and a half. And the goal was really to learn how to use your attention to be more open and receptive to your experience. So you're really training these mindfulness skills in our HIM program. And on the relaxation side, folks did the same stretching activity, but it was much more like 7th grade gym class, where you go, the focus is on trying to touch your toes, and the instructors are cracking jokes. It's not really about training these mindfulness skills. So we could do a real careful comparison here in terms of, is there something special about learning how to train your attention in this way with these mindfulness exercises above and beyond all the other good stuff that you could get with stress management training? Likewise, we had activities around mindful walking in our mindfulness group versus in our relaxation group. They got to just take walks. And we also had some of the stress didactics that are commonly taught in mindfulness programming. But in the mindfulness group, it was really focused on how to respond more mindfully to those stressors. Okay, so we did this 3-day retreat study approach. We did neuroimaging in the 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after the 3-day intervention. Again, we had folks do this resting state, this resting state scan, really to evaluate whether we could see changes in these connectivity patterns of the resting brain. Might mindfulness training increase the coupling of one's resting brain, our default mode network with these regulatory areas of the prefrontal cortex. So that was one thing that we were evaluating here. And critically, we were evaluating whether we could do that with 3 days of mindfulness training relative to a pretty powerful relaxation training program. Is it going to work again? Okay, there it goes. We know that highly stressed unemployed adults have elevated markers of systemic low-grade inflammation. So we actually collected a blood sample when folks first got to the retreat center. So they showed up at our retreat center, they gave us a blood sample. We then randomized them to one of the 2 arms of the retreat center for these programs. We took away their cell phones and they went and took a deep dive with us on training for 3 days. So we took that blood sample before randomization at the retreat center, and then we took another blood sample at 4-month follow-up, really evaluating whether, in this case, mindfulness training could modulate blood markers of inflammation. We are particularly interested in interleukin-6, so I'll tell you about some of the IL-6 findings. So you might recall I told you that there was this previous cross-sectional work with advanced meditators, really showing that there's this difference in terms of resting state functional connectivity with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And so the question is, does 3 days of mindfulness training above and beyond relaxation training produce this same type of brain coupling? And the provisional answer we had in this study was yes. Relative to the relaxation training group, mindfulness training increased the resting state functional connectivity of the default mode network. Again, these were sort of posterior cingulate seeds that we put, that we ran on. And we saw this connectivity with left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So I'm sort of showing you here 3 slices of the brain to show you the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex connectivity. We did not see this coupling effect in our relaxation training group. So really what I'm showing you here is a spreading interaction map. And just to give you a sense for what it actually looked like for left and right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we didn't have groups. The groups weren't different at baseline. So I'm showing here in blue the mindfulness group and in red the relaxation group at baseline and post-treatment. And you can see there's this sort of coupling effect that's happening in our mindfulness group, but not our relaxation group. We're seeing that both on the left and right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And I think this is really interesting because you don't see this sort of inter-network connectivity, in this case with default mode network reaching across to connect with frontoparietal control network nodes. But we are seeing it here with mindfulness training after just 3 days of mindfulness training, and not with just pure relaxation training. It really suggests that maybe mindfulness training might be connecting the resting brain with these prefrontal regions that we know are important for guiding attention and emotion regulation. So we also, as I mentioned, took those blood samples. We looked at systemic markers of inflammation, IL-6 in this case, and we did see some initial evidence here that the mindfulness intervention could reduce IL-6 at 4-month follow-up relative to our relaxation intervention. So some signal here to suggest that mindfulness interventions may have these lasting effects in terms of lowering inflammatory biology in unemployed job-seeking adults. But moreover, what we showed, and I think this is the most interesting piece, is that these changes in functional brain coupling, so the degree that you're sort of coupling that resting brain with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, statistically mediated these benefits in IL-6 at follow-up. In fact, when we ran the mediation analyses, we were really finding that effect of mindfulness interventions on reducing IL-6, about a third of that overall effect was accounted for by changes in this brain functional coupling pattern. So really suggesting that these changes these brain changes that we're observing may matter for longer term markers in terms of stress-related health outcomes in unemployed job-seeking adults. This initial trial we did, first of all, I'll say it was with, it was about 35 unemployed job-seeking adults. So it was a small sample and an initial, I think, proof of concept study that we could do this. And one of the questions we had was, are these effects reproducible? And since this paper has come out, there's now been a couple of other studies that have really shown similar patterns. And I just want to highlight the kind of reproducibility of this effect across a number of samples. First, Tony King had a paper that came out where he did a 16-week mindfulness intervention in veterans. And he finds the same resting state functional connectivity pattern pre-post training. Moreover, he finds that brain coupling is associated with PTSD symptom improvements. So that was a really, I think, interesting signal here that even a very different type of mindfulness intervention in a different population could produce a similar result. Tammy Krall and Richie Davidson's group, they saw the same effect with the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program, and moreover, they see that it's correlated with these sort of white matter connectivity changes as well, really suggesting that this functional connectivity may be mapping on with sort of structural changes. And then I've got a new paper with Danella Hafman, a wonderful child psychiatrist, where she showed this same coupling effect in adolescents after an 8-week mindfulness intervention. In her case, she found that effect was associated with improvements in mood lability. So I don't know, I've seen this now in many places to really start to suggest that this change in resting state brain functional connectivity may be, a really promising brain-based biomarker for resilience that may have impacts on broad-ranging things like, systemic markers of low-grade inflammation, PTSD, mood lability, and so really been pushing the field to take a deeper dive and look at this as a mechanism. But sort of coming back to our stress buffering account, I hope at least I'm going to try to give you sort of illustrative examples, but this kind of speaks to one approach we've taken to sort of looking at this blue pathway in terms of how mindfulness interventions may be increasing activity and functional connectivity with regulatory regions of prefrontal cortex. The other side of the brain story is that mindfulness interventions may be sort of decreasing our sort of brain's stress alarm response over time, in particular, sort of targeting amygdala activity and functional connectivity. We've now got a series of studies looking at this, and to sort of just give you another illustrative example on the red pathway here, we've done some work with Pete Gianaros and others where we've looked at in cross-sectional community samples, larger samples, what's going on with amygdala resting state functional connectivity, and find a pretty reliable signature in terms of higher perceived stress scores, with the perceived stress scale being associated with amygdala coupling with subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. So again, these are sort of resting state scans. You get this sort of reliable kind of stress association with connectivity in these regions, really suggesting that the amygdala sort of maybe reaching out to subgenual ACC in ways to sort of drive a kind of, a stress response pattern. And in some of our work, we've found that people not in mindfulness interventions, but who are self-reporting high mindfulness skills, those folks seem to have less of this coupling, particularly in right amygdala. And I tell you all of this as sort of a backstory just to say that when we looked at resting state functional connectivity of the amygdala in our retreat study that I just told you about, we see that even 3 days of mindfulness training relative to relaxation training can really turn down this type of coupling. So you can see here in this unemployed sample, we have at baseline elevated sort of coupling between amygdala and subgenual ACC, and only in our mindfulness group do we show some decrease in this type of coupling. One interesting side story is that almost all of the work that we've done, whether we're looking at amygdala volumes or sort of functional activity or connectivity of the amygdala with mindfulness interventions, really seems to have this kind of lateralized effect to right amygdala. All the effects are much stronger on the right amygdala. I haven't figured out why that is, but I sort of see that as, I'm sure some of you might have some ideas on that lateralization effect. But anyway, our model goes, our sort of biological embedding account really goes that if we can sort of change these two stress resilience pathways in the brain with mindfulness interventions, presumably we should be able to turn down how one's body is responding when they're provoked or stressed. And we've been looking at this in some different trials, and I wanted to tell you about one trial that looks at how mindfulness interventions might be impacting biological stress reactivity. This was a smartphone training randomized control trial. We recruited 153 stress community adults. I'm only going to tell you about part of the trial here, and then I promise I'm going to return to the rest of the trial on the second part of this talk here. But with this mindfulness training trial, we took a smartphone training approach. Everyone got 14 days of smartphone training, 20 minutes a day. In our mindfulness training group, they were really doing activities to learn how to be more open and receptive to their present moment experience. They're really focusing on mindfulness skills. And in our control group, we had an active coping training program. So much like our retreat study, we really wanted to develop, I think, a good placebo control group. This group got opportunities to sort of think and problem solve on how they were dealing with stressors in their life. We really kind of patterned this after the literature on coping effectiveness training. So we wanted to build a really good coping training program that didn't focus on mindfulness skills. And this study and in our retreat study, when we look at positive treatment expectancies and we ask people, like, how much do you think this program is going to help you? We saw equivalence across these groups and across our retreat study groups as well, really suggesting that these controls we're using are sort of good placebo controls. It's something about mindfulness training above and beyond positive treatment expectancies. We had them complete 3 days of experience sampling before and after the 2-week intervention. I'll tell you about some of that data in the second half of the talk. But critically, for what I want to tell you about now, after they did that 3 days of experience sampling, after their 14-day intervention, we brought them into the lab and we stressed them out. In fact, first we gave them a 20-minute booster training according to the study condition that they were in, and then they were asked to do the Trier social stress test, the TSST. I know I see people here who've used that before. Essentially, it's a really powerful social stress paradigm that we can use in the lab, where people give a 5-minute speech. They're talking about why they're good at things, and they also do 5 minutes of very difficult mental arithmetic. Count backwards from 2083 by 17s. Go. And we have people do this type of stress task in front of 2 evaluators. So these are 2 people wearing white lab coats, and we train them to look really unimpressed with your performance and ask hard questions. So it's a very difficult social stressor. Much like giving an academic talk, you're sort of put in front of an audience, and it reliably sort of activates people's sympathetic nervous system. So you get reliable increases in heart rate and blood pressure responses to this task. And it also activates the HPA axis. You get a very reliable increase in cortisol, which we can measure in saliva. I see Marty's got a question.
I don't want to break the flow, David.
So no, I'm okay with it.
Is this a time for questions?
Yeah, fire away.
Okay, I have actually 3 interrelated questions. So the first is what are the mindfulness exercises? And the reason I ask is 20 plus hours of relaxation training as a control makes no sense to me. So when I've done relaxation training, it asymptotes in about an hour. There's not all that much to learn. So it seems to me that's a really strange control, 20 hours of relaxation training. But my first question is, what are the components of the mindfulness exercises over 20 plus hours?
Yeah, wow. Okay. That's a more involved question, but you have 2 more after that?
Yeah, I do. Okay. I can tell you what they are, but
don't tell me those yet. This is an important one. On the mindfulness side,
actually, let me interrupt and say, whatever Marty has in store for the next 2, we definitely want to hear. But let's defer. Go ahead and answer that one. It's interesting, and I'm eager to hear what the answer is myself. But for other questions, let's all hold them till afterwards, because
fair enough.
It's a big audience, and if people start hopping in, we won't hear all the good stuff that David has to tell us.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I'm at Carnegie Mellon, where people don't let you get past 1 slide. So I felt like I was on a roll so far, but that sounds like a great plan. Martha, you know how it is. Yeah, that's a great question. So with the mindfulness training, the smartphone training, we really built out a 14-day journey. Again, this is 20 minutes a day. We're giving them an opportunity to practice each day. We built it around, we called it body focus. So really it's about learning how to pay attention to body sensations in an open or receptive way, to sort of move through your body and watch these body sensations and get curious and welcome them and really practice these sort of skills. It may sound boring, but it feels quite nuanced as you're going through the program, in the sense that you have an opportunity to each day sort of bring your attention in a kind of curious and open way to these body sensations. And people develop a lot of insights. And, we had a really positive response. People said they really liked this program. On the relaxation side, people in an equivalent way really liked the guidance. We had some visual imagery activities in there where sort of people were thinking about stressors in their life and problem solving. And we built out a number of modules on that. I have a slide somewhere I could probably show where we kind of do a day by day, sequence around those guidances. But, it wasn't, Marty, as you say, like, it didn't feel, I don't think it felt stale for most people, in the sense that, you've asked me to think about that same stressor over and over again. In fact, we're having people work through different stressors over time. And I think the visualization and sort of the kind of problem solving that we had them do came in some different modules that I think people like. So we definitely wanted to make it an engaging program, and we really evaluated in terms of positive treatment expectancies, whether they found it to be beneficial and whether they would recommend it to their friends. And we saw equivalence between the two programs on those. So I think we did a reasonable job. But oftentimes people ask, like, well, how do we find these programs? And we've sort of rebuilt the whole program in a new app. We're just about to release it. So if folks want to test this out or use it for research purposes, I'd be delighted to share it, and you can see for yourself. Marty, I want to come back to your other questions. I will do so maybe at the end, but let me keep going per Martha's instructions. So with this particular laboratory stress challenge task, the question we had, of course, is, does 14 days of mindfulness training above and beyond this sort of nice coping effectiveness training impact people's stress biology? And when we did that, if I can get my slides to go again, there they go. This is the control group. The control group shows this rise in cortisol reactivity to the task. But interestingly, our mindfulness group shows this stress buffering effect. So even just 14 days of mindfulness training reduced people's cortisol reactivity to this task. We take these saliva samples to sort of look at cortisol reactivity. When we look at systolic blood pressure reactivity, you see the same pattern of effects. There's 14 days of mindfulness training reduces systolic blood pressure reactivity to this pretty potent social stressor, the Trier social stress test. So really some initial suggestion here that mindfulness training can modulate people's biological stress response when they're provoked or challenged. And, our argument, of course, has been, well, if mindfulness interventions can turn down recurrent or excessive stress reactivity, in turn, it should be modifying biological processes that play an important role in stress-related health and disease outcomes. And, I previously shown you guys that link between 3-day retreat mindfulness and reduced IL-6 at 4 months follow-up. So that's sort of an example in this space. We've also looked at other health-related immune markers. I can't tell you about all of them, but I wanted to tell you about one new paper we have that I think is pretty cool. We recently completed a mindfulness meditation training trial with lonely older adults. Lonely older adults sort of have the double whammy of being older and being lonely. And what we see in lonely older adults is this sort of lower immune competence. So your immune cells don't seem to respond as well when they're challenged. So that's why, older adults, we know, hearing this a lot during COVID, that they don't have the same immune response to vaccination. They don't have as quick of sort of tissue repair after injury. This is all stuff that's mediated by these immune cells. And one question we had in this particular trial is, well, maybe mindfulness interventions can help. Can they help sort of boost this immunocompetence, your immune cells' ability to respond, essentially, in this lonely older adult sample? So we did this trial. This was with studying mindfulness-based stress reduction. So this is the 8-week MBSR program. We compared it to a matched 8-week health enhancement program without a mindfulness component. And we actually find that mindfulness intervention can more effectively boost immunocompetence in lonely older adults. So what we did is we challenged their immune cells. So we took these blood samples before and after the 8-week intervention, and then in vitro, we basically challenged these immune cells. So we dumped a bacterial challenge, IPS, on these immune cells, and we looked to see, can these immune cells sort of respond to that challenge? So we were looking, in this case, at stimulated production of IL-6. And what we find is that mindfulness intervention, seen here in the black line, boosts this ability for immune cells to respond. So they have this greater stimulated IL-6 production, really suggesting, I think for the first time in the literature, that mindfulness interventions can actually boost sort of functional immune response, and to do so in a population where we're concerned that they're not being able to mount the same response. I just show you this finding because I think it's really exciting, suggests the potential for mindfulness interventions to be potentially an important treatment for boosting wound healing, for recovery from injury, and for maybe even mounting better vaccination responses, which certainly seems relevant in the context of COVID. So just to kind of, I just wanted to give you one example of some work we've been doing on this biological embedding account on this sort of more health end. In this case, some promising suggestion that mindfulness intervention may be able to boost your sort of functional immune response. Okay, so that's the biological embedding account. I hope to at least give you some flavor for thinking about how mindfulness interventions might be changing the brain, might be changing our bodies, and might be changing our stress-related health risks over time across different studies and approaches that we've used. I want to turn next to, I think, an interesting question that we've really been thinking about the last 6 or so years. And that's that, what are the key behavioral skills that people learn in mindfulness interventions that really might be kicking off these biological stress reduction cascades? Like what's the sort of secret sauce of mindfulness interventions? And we've been building out this monitor and acceptance theory account, or MAT theory account, that we've published on. And where we started with this in terms of our sort of theory and research was really asking, like, well, what do people do when they're actually doing mindfulness meditation? Like, that's maybe a good place to start with behavioral skills. And for any of you who've tried it, you can close your eyes, you start to track your breathing in and out in an open or receptive way, noticing breathing in, noticing breathing out. And you start meditating. 15 seconds in, your mind wanders, you start thinking about dinner later. And the training in these mindfulness interventions is really about bringing your attention back to the breath. So in effect, you're really training these attention monitoring skills, right? You train your ability to concentrate, to redirect your attention back when it wanders. And I think everybody in the world has sort of focused on this attention training component of meditation. And what we've been calling out is that there's actually a second set of skills that people learn in mindfulness meditation. So now imagine you've been sitting in meditation for a couple minutes, paying attention to breathing in, breathing out. And what almost always happens is you start getting a pain in your legs, you start getting an annoying itch, you feel agitated, you might feel bored or sleepy. And there are clear instructions for what you're to do in these mindfulness interventions. You're to really foster an open, curious mental stance towards these slings and arrows. What does that pain or agitation feel like? You're really to get curious about it, to welcome it, and to really open to these discomforts. In short, it's really about learning how to develop this mental attitude of acceptance and equanimity when you start to suffer. And we've called the second category of skills acceptance or equanimity skills. And I think this is where we've really theorized that much of the action is around how mindfulness meditation improves health. Meditation provides this amazing opportunity to learn how to really manage discomfort. You develop this whole new attitude of curiosity to benign discomforts during meditation. And over time, you sort of build this equanimity muscle, such that stuff doesn't bother you as much anymore. And so as you move off of the meditation cushion, so to speak, and you face stressors in your life, you're meeting them with a more sort of non-judgmental, non-reactive mental stance to them. So when stressors hit, you don't react to them as much or for as long. And we really argued that these acceptance and equanimity skills really may be the kind of important driving factor for how mindfulness interventions really get under the skin to foster stress resilience and health. So with my graduate student at the time, she's now a faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh, this is Emily Lindsay, we really put out this monitor and acceptance theory account. Our account goes like this. Attention monitoring skills that you learn in mindfulness interventions are really important. They help you focus your attention. They can improve your cognitive performance in non-affective contexts. But learning how to work with your attention, bring your attention back when it wanders, isn't sufficient for the stress resilience effects. In fact, in affective contexts, learning how to use your attention in this way can actually heighten affective reactivity. And one example I like to give is, if you have someone that's having a panic attack and you tell them to pay attention to their body or their breathing, that's going to actually increase their panic symptoms. So attention may not be sufficient, but these acceptance skills really may be the secret sauce, and that they're the ones that are sort of teaching you this non-reactive, non-judgmental stance to your experience. They're going to be the drivers of emotion regulation. They're going to reduce your affective reactivity, improve your stress resilience, and improve your stress-related health outcomes over time. So we sort of put out this theory. We reviewed a body of literature that had looked at self-reported mindfulness skills that included attention monitoring skills and acceptance skills. And our initial theory paper really showed some correlational evidence or support for these kind of ideas. And but Emily and I weren't satisfied with that. And we said, well, we really need to do some randomized control trials where we actually experimentally evaluate this account. And so we did a series of dismantling trials. And I'm going to bring back our familiar smartphone training randomized control trial, because I told you I didn't tell you everything about it. In fact, there was a third treatment arm here. Recall that we had our 2-week mindfulness training arm that had all of this sort of attention monitoring, acceptance, and equanimity skills training components that a mindfulness intervention normally does. So, in our MA group, what we had folks do is, adopt this sort of curious, mental attitude to their experience. We were very explicit about that in the monitor and acceptor MA group. But critically, we had a mindfulness group now where we stripped out all the acceptance and equanimity skills training language. So it was still about learning how to use your attention, bring your attention back when it wanders, really be present to your experience. But we didn't include the language around being open, curious, non-judgmental to your experience and monitor only. Same dose in the two groups, but we were really stripping out that acceptance and equanimity skills piece. And of course, the question then is, if we eliminate learning these acceptance and equanimity skills, do we wipe out a lot of the stress reduction benefits of mindfulness interventions? And so coming back to that figure I showed you earlier, where 14 days of learning, in this case, all these attention monitoring acceptance skills in our MA group, we show that nice cortisol stress buffering effect. But what happens in our MO or our monitor only group? They look more like controls. So in fact, when we did these pairwise comparisons, our monitor only group looks like controls. Our monitor and accept group, the group that got all this acceptance and equanimity skills training, is the group that's showing statistically lower cortisol reactivity to the task, really suggesting that there may be some important role for learning these acceptance and equanimity skills for stress resilience. I had mentioned to you that we collected 3 days of experience sampling. So we were doing, ecological momentary assessments and daily diaries before and after this 14-day intervention. And one of the things that we're finding is that learning these acceptance and equanimity skills not only can reduce your biological stress reactivity, but also seems to carry over in terms of people's daily life well-being and social functioning. So we have a paper out in JPSP showing that learning these acceptance and equanimity skills actually boosts your positive affect in daily life. So measures of well-being and positive emotions increase by learning these acceptance and equanimity skills. And I think it's something about learning how to be more open, non-judgmental, non-reactive to your experience allows you to sort of savor all of those sort of positive emotion moments in your daily life. We know we have lots of those. And so learning these skills, I think, really creates maybe a sort of savoring response where people can really connect more with the positive affect in their daily life. And this is a really robust effect. We saw this sort of increase in positive affect in our monitor and accept group relative to the monitor only and control groups across a number of trials. But it doesn't just seem to have these sort of positive emotional well-being benefits. Learning these acceptance and equanimity skills also bleeds over into improving social functioning variables as well. So we have a paper out in PNAS showing that learning these acceptance and equanimity skills not only lowers your loneliness, so this was self-reported loneliness in our daily diary, but also increases your social connections. We actually find that learning these acceptance and equanimity skills increases the number of meaningful social contacts that you have by about 2 contacts per day. So after 14 days of training, we're really changing people's sort of social connectivity as a function of learning these acceptance and equanimity skills. And I think maybe what's going on here is that, learning how to be more open and non-judgmental, non-reactive to your own experience is allowing you to sort of open up and feel opportunities to connect more with others, which is, I think, a really interesting idea. Okay, so maybe just to kind of cover what ground I've covered on the behavioral pathway side, I think that first I want to just say that we really pushed hard on a theory-guided approach. And our argument here is that really learning these acceptance and equanimity skills may be a key driver for mindfulness intervention effects, not only on decreasing biological stress reactivity, but also seeming to impact daily life positive emotions and social functioning variables as well. And I just wanted to pause and say that, people haven't really looked at acceptance and equanimity in the scientific literature very much. It's been around a lot in culture and world contemplative traditions, but hasn't made its way into science. And I think there's a lot of important implications for this. One is, the last 20 or so years, we've seen a lot of interest in emotion regulation and studying cognitive reappraisal as sort of a emotion regulation strategy, but we haven't really looked much at thinking about acceptance and equanimity skills. And I just think that there's a lot we can do here in terms of looking at this initial work here to look at acceptance and equanimity skills is really a powerful mover for emotion regulation processes. Another thing that I'm really excited about is the possibility that learning acceptance and equanimity skills could be a transdiagnostic process for different intervention modalities. If you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness interventions, or even psychedelic treatments, people report after going through these interventions that they feel more open and accepting to their experience and to others. And so this may be a kind of common mechanism by which these different treatment modalities may hit outcomes. May not just be specific to mindfulness interventions. And then I also want to just say that I think that acceptance and equanimity skills always kind of comes at the back end for clinical mindfulness interventions. Teachers of mindfulness interventions really emphasize the attention skills, but don't emphasize the attitude and the training of how you can relate to your experience in terms of, opening, being curious, and non-reactive to your experience. And I think if we can start to elevate the value of acceptance and equanimity skills, we may be able to create more efficient and effective mindfulness interventions. So I keep calling this out to clinicians who are delivering mindfulness interventions and saying, actually the times when people are really sort of struggling, you're feeling a little reactive and you're really working with that reactivity and sort of trying to sit with it, be present, open to it. That's actually building that equanimity muscle. And I think commonly when people are struggling with meditation, they feel like
Can you AirPlay Zoom?
Oh, okay. I think someone's not on mute. But I think that there's a lot of value in thinking about those moments when you may be struggling with meditation, you may actually be building that equanimity muscle in a meaningful way. And so you're not actually failing, you're actually building that neural plasticity. Okay, so I think it's probably time to wrap up a little bit. I hope this talk has clearly sort of discussed some of these research programs about how mindfulness interventions become embedded for health. Really talking about some of the key biological pathways, some of the key behavioral skills that they learn that really may be kind of driving this biological embedding. And I've tried to highlight a couple studies along the way to sort of illustrate these points. And we've covered a fair amount of ground. I just want to mention some next steps on stuff that we're doing in case that might stimulate some conversation. One of the things that we did here in our work with the behavioral skills side is we really studied stressed community adults. These are mostly healthy, stressed people. And one of the questions we've had is, well, does learning these acceptance and equanimity skills, does it also impact stress-related health outcomes in patient populations? And so we've got a new R01. We're doing a big dismantling randomized control trial in irritable bowel syndrome patients, where we're going to be looking at these interventions and outcomes. Now looking at whether we can move symptoms, and we're also doing stool samples to look at changes in gut microbiome. So kind of building out some of the biological embedding work there too. And, I mentioned this at the very beginning of the talk, but a lot of my interests now have been really shifting to thinking about the digital therapeutics landscape. And can we build more scalable and effective digital mindfulness interventions for addressing stress and burnout? We're really doing a lot in healthcare systems. I think there's a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities to sort of thinking about how we can leverage the best of digital therapeutics to really scale mindfulness interventions in a way we haven't been able to before, both for our science and for healthcare and society. And it's a challenging problem, but really one that we're investing in. And you can see some of I presented some of the initial digital mindfulness training work as sort of a proof of concept in that space. And, I think I always sort of present this and it sounds great, but I want to just put a sort of cautionary note on the whole thing and say, I still think, I showed you where we're at in terms of the number of RCTs, and we're really kind of in our adolescence as a mindfulness interventions literature. And I think we still need a lot of good work around large multi-site trials, probing health outcomes. I've tried to show you some initial ideas that I think hopefully can stick and move the field forward, but we are still early in the game, and hopefully I can talk some of you into joining us on this work. I'll just say first, I want to thank all of our funders. I have certainly some conflict of interest disclosures. Headspace, they gave us a bunch of research money to do a collaborative project. We're spinning out a new mindfulness meditation app that supports this equanimity skills training stuff. So it's called EquiHealth. So you can keep an eye out for that. If you're interested, I can send you information. And I've got this whole host of collaborators and of course, funders to support this work. It's been a wonderful journey so far, and I really thank you all for taking the time out of your rainy Thursday to hear about this work. Thanks.